is there still a question of whether or not the president is going to sign this thing? I mean, they're already talking about getting additional money from elsewhere.
I've been talking to White House sources all morning, and they are reiterating that the president has not definitively decided whether or not he's going to sign this bill. They're cautioning anybody who's saying that the president will sign this bill to say, hey, that's not where we can say, that's not where we are yet. The president is really the wild card here. It's likely that he's going to sign it, and people around him think that because he doesn't want another shutdown and because he also has looked at other pots of money to get funding for the wall, that he wants to move forward on that. But it's also one of those things where the president wants to come out looking like a winner. He wants to keep that facade and that image that he's the person who is the architect of the art of the deal. So as a result, the president really is weighing whether or not he should listen to Sean Hannity and Laura Ingraham and Lou Dobbs, who have called this deal pathetic and an insult to the president, or whether he can just side with his own Republican Party and Republicans on the Hill who say we cannot afford another shutdown.
Yes, but I watched Laura Ingraham, and she's already trying to make the argument that border fencing that they've agreed to pay for is a wall. It's not. And they also continue to push this argument that the president has made that he is already building a wall. Also incorrect. Bill, if the president could get the money from elsewhere, from other, pull pots of money from other sources, why didn't he do that already?
Look, forgive me for this, Stephanie. Maybe this is sacrilege, but I think it's kind of brilliant political theater that he's engaging in. I think this is
for sure.
I think this is part of his 2020 re-election campaign of tacking to the center now. I think you saw it in the State of the Union address, where he almost seemed like a normal human being part of the time. And I think now he's saying, look, I don't want a government shutdown. I'm going to sign this thing even though those crazy Democrats won't give me what I want. I can't deal with them. They're nuts. I tried to do what I could for you guys, and I'm doing the best I can so the government stays open. I think this is step 2 in a long series of events that is going to show that he's tacking to the political center as part of his effort to get reelected.
Wow. I mean, he had Jared and Ivanka sitting behind him. We know at the State of the Union, he had Alice Johnson there. He's talking criminal justice reform. Does Bill have a point? I want to play yesterday part of what he said about where the additional money could come from.
I'm not happy. But am I happy with where we're going? I'm thrilled, because we're supplementing things and moving things around, and we're doing things that are fantastic and taking from far less important areas.
Far less important areas, including flood control projects and disaster relief. What do you think?
Look, even if he got all the money he claims he can get, it's going to be a pittance. We're talking about probably under $1 billion. And bear in mind that just about a year ago, he could have had $25 billion for border security. He turned that down. Then it went down to what it is, 1.3 billion. Maybe he'll be able to supplement it. And it's not even clear that that's legal, what he's doing. Up to $2 billion, but the idea that this is going to create any kind of substantial border fencing that meets the demands of the Laura Ingrahams of the world is a joke. And maybe this is tacking towards the center, but the American people can add. The American people can see, first of all, even if they agree with the need for a wall, which most people don't, which is that the size of this thing keeps getting smaller and smaller. We're going from the Trump Tower to the Trump House in Queens circa 1937 is what we're getting.
Okay, but we do have to remind our audience that even if he got the $5.7 billion, that pales in comparison to the amount of money you would need to build a complete border wall. But I don't know that you're right when you say
$5.7 billion is what it takes to build like a modern destroyer, maybe 2 in the United States Navy, just to put it in perspective.
Okay,
this is not a major construction.
But to say that the American people can add, and I'm not trying to insult the American people, can they? The president, with Kirstjen Nielsen standing next to them, had a plaque with his name on it, put on a piece of border fencing that was corrective fencing that Obama had funded. And there he is. Here's my wall. So do you really think that the American people can add in a way that they're going to hold them to account? They haven't thus far.
Americans saying that a sucker's born every minute, but I don't think we have so many suckers in this country.
Okay, well
Stephanie, there was never going to be a wall, so this is like the best he was ever going to get.
Okay, well then, exactly to this point, and Americans know better, What if you're an American who says, wait a minute, they're going to reallocate money? What if they're reallocating it from my district, from my state? Is that going to pose a real political problem for the president?
I think it does. And I think that it makes it harder for him to tack to the center, precisely because he then needs to make the case that border security, as he's been arguing, is a serious crisis on par with natural disasters, with flood relief, with areas that are in desperate need of cash from the federal government.
If you lived in the state of Louisiana that votes red, and suddenly money against flood protecting, where they are losing land every day, suddenly you're going to start to say, I'm not so keen on that wall.
I think that's going to be the problem for him in this next step. I think that's why he tried to make the border wall funding a key part of the last government shutdown, because he thought he was ultimately going to win, and that then there would be a clean allocation of money. He wouldn't be taking money away from some specific other purpose. And that's the area he's going to be wading in now. And as you've got the 2020 field growing by the day, all of those candidates are going to be pouncing on this, finding people whose homes are in need of help, clear examples of Americans who are desperate for that money from the federal government. And they're going to say, Mr. President, how is this person not in need of this money? Why does it need to go to a border wall?
Well, then, is this just, Yamiche, a game of short-termism? The Lindsey Grahams of the world and Mitch McConnells are just, hey, Mr. President, just sign this now. You can find the other money from other places, and they'll worry about that problem when it comes?
I think there's that idea that could happen, but I've interviewed a lot of Trump supporters, and I specifically am thinking about a couple in a place called Macery, Ohio, where and it's nicknamed Misery, Ohio, where it's so poor. They were at one point, they literally made $9,000 a year, and there was going to be a HUD program that was going to be taken away from them. They needed to repair their roof, and they were Trump supporters. And I said, are you okay if the HUD takes away this program that's going to help with your roof? And they said yes, as long as the Mexicans don't get in on the border. Now, these people are thousands and thousands of miles away from the border. Their town is not overly populated by immigrants by any stretch of the means. It was overly white, and it was a majority white area. And they said they were very, very worried and were willing to sacrifice their own personal roof, their own personal safety for this idea of a wall. So I think we should not underestimate the idea that this president has really created and ginned up this idea that there's a crisis on the border and that there are at least a fraction of the population that are going to follow him to that. And I also think it's important to note that the president can say in some issue that this debate is happening on the terms that he wanted, because at one point the White House was saying, you know what, the president's going to compromise. He's going to change the materials of the wall. He's going to do it steel instead of concrete. And Democrats said that's ridiculous. That's not a compromise. And at the end of the day, he's getting some money for some funding for the wall. It's 55 miles instead of 2,000 miles, but it's something that he can stand up and say, I got this for you.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.